He wa'a he moku he wa'a. The canoe is an island, the island is a canoe. The Polynesian Triangle is an area of 10 million square miles within the Pacific Ocean, defined by the 3 points of Hawaii, Aotearoa, or New Zealand, and Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. Within this triangle, whether on Atafu, Vava'u, or Tahiti, one will find a closely related constellation of languages, customs, myths, tools, and skills. The ancestors of modern-day Polynesians colonized the largest ocean on the planet, occupying almost every habitable atoll or volcanic peak protruding above the waves, in what is perhaps the greatest story of seafaring in human history. My own fascination with this story began as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Kingdom of Tonga. I've always been an antiquarian, biased towards the earliest days of any culture or region. One day, when visiting the main island of Tongatapu, I got a chance to see a local archaeologist's collection of artifacts stored in his beach house. Among the whalebone war clubs, shell beads, and other items was this potsherd. It's a fragment of a Lapita pottery vessel from perhaps 900 BC, from Nukuleka, the earliest known settlement in Tonga. For me, this potsherd started an obsession, and it's a useful touchstone in this story. This is because Tonga seems to have been the first place within the Polynesian Triangle where the first settlers made landfall. But where did those first people, the Lapita, come from? We can trace the origins of this world back 5,000 years, and several thousand miles to the northwest of Tonga. But just before we get to that, there are a few linguistic and geographic terms that you should know. First of all, Polynesian languages are part of a broader Austronesian language family, and the Lapita spoke one language within this family, called Proto-Oceanic, from which Polynesian languages are descended. Second of all, Oceania is usually divided into two regions, Near Oceania and Remote Oceania. Near Oceania comprises Papua New Guinea, along with the Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomon Islands, a biologically diverse region first settled tens of thousands of years ago during the Ice Age. By contrast, Remote Oceania includes all the Pacific Islands to the north, east, and southeast of Near Oceania. The Lapita's own ancestors first emerged beginning around 3000 BC, as ceramic-making, maritime peoples on the island of Taiwan. Over the next millennia and a half, their descendants expanded over the islands of Southeast Asia. These expanding Austronesian peoples were horticulturalists. Linguistic reconstructions of Proto-Austronesian find words for such crops as taro, coconut, banana, breadfruit, and for animals like chickens and dogs. These were Neolithic peoples, bringing with them their suite of domestic plants and animals. Ethnobotanist Edgar Anderson first coined the idea of a consistent, transported landscape of the oceanic world. And while settlers didn't always bring every one of their domestic species, there is a broadly consistent set that moved with people across the Pacific. It even included hitchhikers like the Polynesian rat. Such linguistic reconstructions of Proto-Austronesian also find words associated with innovative sailing vessels. Their outrigger canoes must have been a novel sight in Pacific waters, and they established stilt house settlements fringing the beaches of Nassau, New Ireland, and New Britain. Kirch asks us to imagine this new group of immigrant mariners meeting the diverse, indigenous Papuan peoples of the region. He argues that finally, in the Bismarck Archipelago, it was this fusion of peoples that produced the early Lapita cultural complex, which perhaps adopted earth oven cooking and local tree crops like almonds from indigenous populations. Now, most of remote Oceania was uninhabited at the time of Lapita expansion, although there are a few exceptions in Micronesia that seem to have been peopled by closely related Austronesian groups. In large part, though, it was the Lapita on the lead edge of human colonization. Their voyages carried them as far south as New Caledonia, where we see sites like Vacha, and east into the Polynesian Triangle. From Nukuleka on Tongatapu, where this artifact I mentioned earlier originated, they continued northeast, reaching the Samoan sites of Mulifanua and To'aga. This expansion was rapid, a few centuries at most, and complete by around 900 BC. Archaeologists have debated what prompted such a fast spread. Demographic growth seems like an unlikely explanation, given that within only a few generations of an island being settled, there were already people moving on to the next one, too fast for population pressure to build up. The strongest explanation I can find comes from Peter Bellwood. He argues that it was the Lapita social structure that pulled people to keep exploring. We know from linguistic reconstruction that the Lapita tied social status to birth order, with older and younger siblings ranked. It's possible in this period only firstborn offspring would have inherited their parents' land and other resources. If this is true, a founder-focused ideology could have encouraged settlement of new islands, as well as new parts of known islands, as this would have greatly raised the status of the founders. We also infer that Lapita peoples were organized into social groups called kainanga, which were descent groups who traced their origins back to a founding ancestor, and who had rights to land and resources based on their descent from this founder. As settlers moved across the Lapita world, they also relied on marine resources. Shellfish like clams, oysters, and cowries, nearshore species like parrotfish, surgeonfish, and eels, and also big pelagic open water species like tuna, shark, rays, and sea turtle. One group of researchers have argued that the initial stages of island settlement, in particular, might have been accompanied by a reliance on marine resources before plant crops became established. In any case, between 900 BC and 700 BC, the Lapita world began to fragment, as different island groups developed in unique ways. After the initial Lapita colonization of Tonga and Samoa, there was a period called the Long Pause. More than 1,500 years passed before expansion into the Polynesian Triangle continued. It was not until around AD 1000 when the central islands of eastern Polynesia, like the Society Islands, Marquesas, the Cook Islands, and Mangareva, were reached from Samoa in a burst of settlement. This long pause is still not fully understood, although the best explanation seems to be the development of double-hulled, catamaran-style canoes and other sailing technologies, finally allowing people to continue onwards beyond Samoa. Thor Heyerdahl became famous for his 1947 kon-tiki expedition, sailing a raft 8,000 miles across the Pacific, from Peru to Tahiti. His goal? To prove that Polynesia was peopled from South America rather than from Asia. He had the intuition that because the prevailing winds of Polynesia travel east to west, it would have been easier for people to sail with the wind out across the ocean from South America. We now know that he was wrong, and wrong in many ways. What's really interesting is that his intuition about the wind and currents is also totally backwards. Heyerdahl's vision of a single raft casting out into the unknown, carried by winds and currents towards mysterious destinations with no easy way home, is not how it worked. The fact that winds trended east to west is part of why settlement from Asia makes more sense. Predictable breaks in the predominant trade winds gave people a chance to strike out east, but when the winds inevitably turned back, they could ride them simply by tracking their latitude using the stars right back to their home island. In this way, voyages could be careful, probing endeavors rather than some kind of shot in the dark. Jeff Irwin has proposed a sophisticated model of Pacific exploration based on this idea, with expansion proceeding as a series of great arcs of exploration. After the long pause, the exact sequence of settlement in eastern Polynesia is difficult to determine because the dates are so tightly clustered. In the 1960s, Emery and Sinoto suggested that the Marquesas Islands were the first in eastern Polynesia to be settled. Many oral traditions favor Raiatea, also traditionally known as Hawaii. It now seems to be the case that a broader group of islands, from the Marquesas to the Society Islands to Mangareva and Rarotonga, were settled nearly simultaneously, forming a broader sort of homeland region from which more distant islands were colonized. Sometime around AD 1000, the Hawaiian Islands were settled. Aotearoa was settled sometime around AD 1200. Even Rapa Nui was settled around the same time. In the ultimate ironic twist for Heyerdahl's legacy, we now have evidence that it was the Polynesians who made it to South America. We know they acquired the sweet potato, which spread back west all the way to Aotearoa. In fact, the Proto-Eastern Polynesian word for sweet potato, kumara, probably came from the South American word for sweet potato, kumar. They probably brought bottle gourds back with them around the same time, although it's also possible that those spread after European contact. A 2020 genetic study has also found conclusive evidence for prehistoric contact of Polynesian individuals with Native American individuals around AD 1200, contemporaneous with the settlement of remote Oceania. The island ecosystems of Polynesia were shaken by humankind's arrival. Numerous species of birds, both seabirds and terrestrial flightless birds, were hunted to extinction. The most famous example is on Aotearoa, where 11 species of flightless birds called moa were driven extinct. The largest of these, Dinornis giganteus, might have been the tallest bird ever to exist, standing at almost 4 meters or 12 feet tall. They were hunted so widely in the early period of Maori prehistory that archaeological middens were packed so full of bone that they were commercially mined in the late 19th and early 20th century in order to make bone meal fertilizer. Species like pigs and the Pacific rat decimated island ecosystems. Indigenous forests were replaced with grasslands. Islands like Mangareva and Rapa Nui were almost completely deforested. It is no question to say that among the remote oceanic islands, the biodiversity crisis began not recently, but 3,200 years ago with the Lapita expansion. This wasn't a one-way street either. Island environments also shaped island societies. Human and natural systems were linked in a dynamic coupling. Low-lying atolls could often support only a few hundred or perhaps a few thousand people. Atoll chains like the Northern Cook Islands or the Tuamotu Islands of French Polynesia lie only a few feet above the waterline. Their inhabitants had to rely on a thin lens of freshwater present beneath island sediments. This layer of freshwater could be accessed by digging shallow wells, both for drinking as well as for cultivating crops like swamp taro and breadfruit. The lack of stone taught atoll people to make tools from coral and shell, and they could make only limited use of domestic animals. These islands never developed densely populated hierarchical societies, and there are many cases where atolls were eventually abandoned, such as Malden Island, Kirmati, and Maire Island. On the South Island of New Zealand, cooler, temperate conditions were less conducive to Polynesian crops, and its people largely turned to hunting and gathering at low population densities. On the North Island, intensive cultivation of sweet potatoes, yams, taro, gourds, and other crops led to a highly stratified, populous, and intensely warlike society. In the largest, most rich archipelagos like Tonga and Hawaii, societies even developed into archaic states. On Tonga, LiDAR surveys have revealed evidence for huge, low-density urban centers. The diversity of Polynesian societies is endlessly interesting to an anthropologist. This is part of the beauty of archaeology in Oceania. The endless variety of islands and social development offer us something like natural laboratories, allowing us to witness diverse cultural changes across time, emerging out of quite similar founding populations. Perhaps in no other place on Earth can we find such a perfect microcosm of the human story. The development and dynamics of social environmental systems are not only relatively clear on Polynesian islands, but they are clearer on Polynesian islands than anywhere else in the world. Polynesian islands are remarkable models for understanding how social ecological systems can arise and develop, and thus are models for understanding the long-term sustainability of human societies. To close with an oration by Chief Tafolo, as recorded in 1924, speaking to the history and archaeology of Tonga. Pardon me, noble chiefs and lineages, for the searching place is now far and difficult. The old plantations once scattered on the roads have now quite disappeared, and gone with them their generation. But although they now lie in very thick bush, search will be made, at any rate, for Tuia Futuna, the first rock, where our origin began. Though these are only traditions and fables, 'tis here the inquirers get their facts.